Sometimes life gives you a second chance when you least expect it, and sometimes that second chance comes from the most unlikely messenger, a 4-year-old girl with dirt on her dress and hope in her heart. In the Wyoming Territory, mountain man Jeremiah Cross has been living alone for 12 years, carrying grief like stones in his pockets. Then one day, little Annie Fletcher walks right up to him and says, "My mama needs a strong man, and you need a wife." Her mother, Rebecca, has been struggling to save their ranch since her husband died. Jeremiah thinks he's forgotten how to be part of a family. But this brave little girl sees something in him that he's buried deep, the heart of a man who still has love to give. Can a lonely mountain man find the courage to love again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun crested over the jagged peaks of the Teton Range, casting long shadows across Jeremiah Cross's weathered cabin. Steam rose from his tin coffee cup as he stood on the narrow porch, surveying the wilderness that had been his only companion for 12 years. At 54, his shoulders still carried the breadth of a man who'd worked hard all his life, though the lines around his dark eyes spoke of sorrows that ran deeper than any physical labor could carve. Inside the cabin, everything sat exactly where it should be. His rifle hung on wooden pegs above the stone fireplace. His boots waited by the door, cleaned and oiled. The single plate, cup and fork he used for every meal lay drying on a rough-hewn shelf. This was a man who'd reduced his life to the essentials, stripping away anything that might remind him of what he'd lost. But hidden beneath the loose floorboard, near his bed, lay a small wooden box, worn smooth by years of handling. Inside rested a thin gold wedding band, still bright despite the passage of time. Jeremiah hadn't opened that box in 3 years, but he felt its presence every night when sleep eluded him and memories crept in like mountain fog. The morning ritual never varied. Coffee first, then a check of his traps along the creek that wound down toward the valley. He'd built his life around routines that demanded nothing of his heart, only his hands and his survival instincts. The mountains didn't ask questions or expect conversation. They simply endured season after season, year after year, and that suited Jeremiah just fine. Down in the valley, the town of Millfield was already stirring to life, though Jeremiah could barely make out the thin wisps of smoke rising from chimneys. He visited town only when necessity demanded it, for ammunition, salt, or the occasional tool that wore beyond repair. The townspeople knew him by sight, but not by nature. They called him the Mountain Man, and he preferred it that way. What Jeremiah couldn't see from his elevated perch was the daily struggle unfolding in a small ranch house on the outskirts of Millfield. Rebecca Fletcher stood at her kitchen window, watching the sunrise paint the distant mountains pink and gold, while her 4-year-old daughter Annie sat at the wooden table, carefully feeding spoonfuls of porridge to her worn rag doll. "Dolly's hungry this morning," Annie announced with the serious tone children reserve for their most important tasks. The doll's faded dress had been mended countless times, its button eyes loose and wobbling, but to Annie it was perfect. It was the last gift her father had given her before the fever took him 2 winters past. Rebecca smiled, despite the weight pressing on her shoulders. At 28, she possessed the kind of beauty that came from within, warm brown eyes that crinkled when she laughed, auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper, and hands that bore the calluses of honest work. But the worry, lines that hadn't been there 3 years ago, told the story of a woman carrying burdens too heavy for one person. "She certainly is," Rebecca agreed, checking the biscuits in the oven. "And what about you, little one? Are you going to eat your breakfast or just watch Dolly eat hers?" Annie giggled, finally taking a bite of her own porridge. "Mama, why don't we have a papa like other girls?" The question hit Rebecca like a physical blow, though she'd been expecting it. Children Annie's age were beginning to notice such things, especially when they played with other children in town. She sat down across from her daughter, choosing her words carefully. Well, sweetie, you did have a papa. He loved you very much, but he had to go to heaven before you were old enough to remember him well. I know about papa in heaven, Annie said matter-of-factly, swinging her legs under the table. But I mean a papa who's here, like Mr. Morrison has for his little girl, or like Mrs. Patterson's husband, who helps her carry the heavy things. Rebecca felt her throat tighten. The truth was, she'd noticed those same things herself. The way married couples in town seemed to share their burdens, the way a man's presence could make even the hardest tasks feel manageable. But love wasn't something you could simply decide to find, like picking apples from a tree. Sometimes life gives us what we need when we're ready for it, she said finally. Right now, we have each other, and we're doing just fine. But even as she spoke the words, Rebecca's eyes drifted to the stack of papers on the kitchen counter. Bank notices, each one more urgent than the last. The drought had decimated last year's crops, and the cattle prices had dropped so low she'd barely made enough to feed the animals, let alone pay the mortgage. The numbers were simple and unforgiving. Without a miracle, they'd lose the ranch. Before winter, Annie seemed to sense her mother's distraction. With the intuitive wisdom that children sometimes possess, she slipped from her chair and wrapped her small arms around Rebecca's waist. "Don't worry, Mama. I'll think of something." The words should have been comforting, but they only deepened Rebecca's heartache. A 4-year-old shouldn't have to worry about thinking of solutions to adult problems. Yet Annie had grown up watching her mother struggle alone, had absorbed the weight of their circumstances in ways Rebecca wished she hadn't. After breakfast, Rebecca harnessed their aging horse to the small wagon and loaded it with the butter and eggs she'd managed to produce that week. The trip to town would bring, in a few coins, enough perhaps to buy flour and a small piece of salt pork for Sunday dinner. Annie perched beside her on the wagon seat, chattering about the clouds that looked like animals and the birds that seemed to be racing them down the mountain road. The town of Millfield sprawled along both sides of Willow Creek, a collection of weathered buildings that had grown organically around the original trading post. The general store stood at the heart of it all, its covered porch serving as an unofficial gathering place where news and gossip flowed as freely as the creek water. As Rebecca pulled up to the hitching post, she noticed the usual cluster of men discussing the weather, the territorial government, and anyone who wasn't present to defend themselves. "Morning, Mrs. Fletcher," called out Homer Kincaid, touching the brim of his hat. He was a kind man, a widower himself who understood something about loss, though his hardware store provided a steadier income than farming ever had. "Good morning, Mr. Kincaid," Rebecca replied, lifting Annie down from the wagon. "How's business been?" "Can't complain, though I hear tell the railroad might be coming through in the next few years. That'll change things around here considerable." The mention of progress and change reminded Rebecca how tenuous her own position had become. Change might bring opportunity for some, but it also brought higher land values and taxes she couldn't afford. She gathered her basket of goods and headed into the general store, Annie's small hand clasped firmly in hers. Inside, Martha Holbrook greeted them with genuine warmth. Martha had known Rebecca since she'd first arrived in Millfield as a young bride, had celebrated with her during the good times, and mourned with her through the losses. "Rebecca, dear, you look tired. Are you getting enough sleep?" "As much as Annie allows," Rebecca replied with a forced lightness. "You know how children are." But Martha's experienced eye caught what Rebecca was trying to hide. The dress that had been taken in to disguise weight loss. The worn boots that should have been replaced a season ago. The way Rebecca's gaze lingered a moment too long on items she couldn't afford. "I've got some nice fabric that came in last week," Martha said. "Carefully. Beautiful blue cotton that would look lovely on Annie. Mrs. Henderson ordered it but changed her mind, so I'm letting it go for cost." Interested, Rebecca felt the familiar burn of pride and necessity warring in her chest. Martha's kindness was genuine, but charity, even well-intentioned charity, left its own kind of scars. "That's very thoughtful," But we're fine for now, she managed. While the women spoke in the careful language of small-town diplomacy, Annie had wandered to the window that faced the mountains. Her attention had been caught by a lone figure making his way down the creek path, moving with the unhurried pace of a man who owned his time completely. "Mama," she whispered, tugging at Rebecca's skirt. "Who's that man?" Rebecca followed her daughter's gaze and felt something flutter in her chest. Not fear exactly, but a recognition of something powerful and untamed. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in buckskins that had seen hard use. His dark hair hung past his collar, and even at a distance there was something in his bearing that spoke of absolute self-reliance. "That's Mr. Cross," Martha said, lowering her voice. "Lives up in the mountains, keeps to himself mostly, but he's honest in his dealings. Lost his family some years back, poor soul." Annie pressed her face against the glass, studying the stranger, with the intense focus she usually reserved for examining interesting rocks or unusual insects. "He looks lonely," she announced with startling clarity. Rebecca felt her cheeks warm. "Annie, it's not polite to stare." But as she gently pulled her daughter away from the window, Rebecca found her own eyes drawn back to the solitary figure. There was something in his movements, controlled, careful, like a man who'd learned to depend only on himself. She recognized something in that solitude, a kinship born of loss and the daily work of survival. Martha had noticed the exchange and filed it away in her memory alongside 100 other small observations that made up the fabric of small-town life. She'd seen how Rebecca's eyes had softened when she looked at the mountain man, had noticed how Annie seemed drawn to him with a child's unerring instinct for character. After completing her modest purchases, Rebecca loaded Annie back into the wagon and began the journey home. But as they passed the creek where Jeremiah was filling his water containers, something unprecedented happened. Annie suddenly stood up in the moving wagon, cupped her hands around her mouth, and called out with all the force her small lungs could muster. "Hello, mountain man, what's your name?" Rebecca's heart nearly stopped. She pulled the horse to an abrupt halt and turned to find Jeremiah Cross looking up at them with an expression of complete bewilderment. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the three of them formed a tableau against the backdrop of the Wyoming wilderness. The struggling widow, the fearless child, and the hermit who'd forgotten that human connection was possible. Jeremiah straightened slowly, his dark eyes moving from Annie's bright face to Rebecca's mortified expression. When he spoke, his voice carried the roughness of disuse, like a tool that hadn't been handled in too long. "Jeremiah," he said simply, "Jeremiah Cross." Annie beamed, as if she'd just solved the world's greatest mystery. "I'm Annie Fletcher, and this is my mama, Rebecca. We live in the house with the blue shutters." Rebecca wanted to disappear into the wagon bed, but something in Jeremiah's expression, surprise, perhaps even the ghost of amusement, kept her from fleeing immediately. "Annie," she said weakly, "we should let Mr. Cross get back to his business." But Annie had already moved on to her next question. "Do you live all by yourself up in the mountains?" "I do," Jeremiah replied, his attention now fully focused on the child with the earnest eyes and the fearless heart. "That must be very quiet," Annie observed. "Don't you get lonely?" The question hung in the air like morning mist, impossible to ignore and far too penetrating for casual conversation. Jeremiah felt something shift inside his chest, a door he'd kept locked for 12 years, rattling against its hinges. "Sometimes quiet is what a man needs," he said carefully. Annie considered this with the gravity of a philosopher. "Mama says sometimes we need to be brave and try new things, even when we're scared." Rebecca felt heat flood her face. Her daughter's innocent words had just revealed more about their circumstances than she'd intended to share with anyone alone a stranger. "Annie, that's enough questions," she said firmly, gathering the reins. "Mr. Cross, I apologize for—" "No need," Jeremiah interrupted, his eyes meeting Rebecca's for the first time. What he saw there, strength tempered by vulnerability, pride wrapped around fear, stirred something he'd thought was buried forever. She's a fine child, asks good questions. As Rebecca guided the wagon away from the creek, she felt Jeremiah's gaze following them until they disappeared around the bend. Behind them, Jeremiah stood perfectly still, his water containers forgotten, trying to understand why a 4-year-old's simple questions had shaken the foundation of the life he'd so carefully constructed. That night, in the cabin that had been his sanctuary and his prison, Jeremiah found himself unable to settle into his usual evening routine. He kept hearing Annie's voice, asking if he got lonely, kept seeing Rebecca's face when embarrassment and something else, interest perhaps, had colored her cheeks. And for the first time in 12 years, the silence that surrounded him felt less like peace and more like an absence waiting to be filled. 3 days after their encounter by the creek, Rebecca Fletcher received news that would change everything. She was hanging laundry on the line behind her house when she saw the dust cloud approaching from town. Her heart sank when she recognized the rider, Theodore Jameson from the Millfield Bank, a thin man with calculating eyes who smiled too much when delivering bad news. "Mrs. Fletcher," he called out, dismounting with an efficiency that spoke of many such visits. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Rebecca dried her hands on her apron, steeling herself for what she knew was coming. Inside the house, she could hear Annie talking to her doll, her voice bright with the innocent chatter of childhood. The contrast between her daughter's carefree world and the conversation about to unfold felt like a knife turning in Rebecca's chest. "Mr. Jameson," she replied evenly. "I suppose this isn't a social call." His smile faltered slightly at her directness. "Well, no. I'm afraid it's bank business. May we speak privately?" Rebecca glanced toward the house, then back at the banker. "Annie's inside. Whatever you have to say, please say it quickly." Jameson reached into his leather satchel and withdrew a document that Rebecca recognized with a sinking heart. Official. Bank stationery, with numbers that represented the slow collapse of her world. "The mortgage payment is now 90 days past due," he said, his voice taking on the rehearsed tone of a man who delivered similar news many times before. "The bank has been more than patient, considering your circumstances, but we simply cannot extend the terms any further." "How long do I have?" Rebecca asked, proud that her voice remained steady. 30 days from today to bring the account current, or the property will be subject to foreclosure proceedings." The number hit her like a physical blow. She'd known this day was coming, had seen it approaching like storm clouds on the horizon, but hearing the words spoken aloud made it terrifyingly real. "Mr. Jameson, surely there's some arrangement we can make. I'm expecting payment for this season's butter and eggs, and if the weather holds—" "Mrs. Fletcher," he interrupted gently, "we both know that what you'll earn from butter and eggs won't cover what you owe. You need $800 to bring the mortgage current. That's more than most folks in Millfield make in 2 years. $800. The sum might as well have been 8,000 or 8 million. Rebecca felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, the future she'd been fighting to build for Annie crumbling like sand. "There might be another option," Jameson continued, his tone becoming almost fatherly. "I've been authorized to discuss the possibility of a sale to an interested party, someone who recognizes the value of this property and might be willing to offer you favorable terms." "What kind of terms?" "Well, Mr. Coulter has expressed interest in purchasing the ranch. He'd allow you and your daughter to remain in the house, of course, as his wife." The words hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Rebecca felt her stomach clench as the full implication became clear. Douglas Coulter owned the largest ranch in the county, a successful operation that had weathered the recent economic troubles without significant hardship. He was also a widower of 52, who'd made his interest in Rebecca painfully obvious at every church social and town gathering for the past year. "Mr. Coulter is a good man," Jameson pressed on, apparently taking her silence as consideration rather than revulsion. "Established, financially secure, your daughter would want for nothing. And if I refuse his generous offer?" Rebecca asked, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Jameson's smile disappeared entirely. Then I'm afraid we'll have no choice but to proceed with foreclosure. The property will be sold at auction, and you'll have 10 days to vacate. After the banker left, Rebecca stood in her yard for a long time, staring at the mountains where she knew Jeremiah Cross lived his solitary life. She envied him suddenly, envied his freedom to choose isolation, his ability to walk away from complications and expectations. What must it be like, she wondered, to answer to no one but yourself? The sound of Annie's laughter from inside the house broke through her reverie, reminding her that she didn't have the luxury of philosophical contemplation. She had a daughter to protect, a child whose entire world depended on the decisions Rebecca made in the next 30 days. That evening, while Annie played quietly with her doll, Rebecca sat at the kitchen table with her late husband's Bible spread. Open before her, it had been his most treasured possession, a leather-bound King James version that bore the marks of daily use. Between its pages, she'd pressed the wildflowers from their wedding day and kept the love letters he'd written during their brief courtship. She wasn't looking for divine guidance exactly, though she wouldn't have refused it. Instead, she was seeking the comfort of routine, the familiar ritual of reading the words that had given her husband strength during his own times of struggle. Her finger traced the margin notes he'd written in his careful handwriting, small observations and questions that revealed the depth of his faith. "Mama!" Annie appeared at her elbow, dragging her beloved ragdoll behind her. "Why do you look sad?" Rebecca forced a smile, pulling her daughter onto her lap. "Just thinking, sweetie. Grown-ups do that sometimes. Are you thinking about the man who came to visit today? He looked important, but not nice important, serious important." Sometimes Annie's perceptiveness startled Rebecca. Her daughter seemed to absorb adult emotions like a sponge, understanding far more than her years should allow. "He brought some news about the ranch," Rebecca said carefully. "Nothing for you to worry about." "Is someone trying to take our house?" Annie asked, with the directness of childhood. Rebecca felt tears threaten for the first time since Jameson's visit. "We might have to move somewhere else, Annie. Would that frighten you?" To her surprise, Annie shook her head confidently. "No, Mama. I've been thinking too, and I have an idea. A really good idea." "Oh, what kind of idea?" "Well," Annie began, settling more comfortably on Rebecca's lap and speaking with the gravity of someone announcing a significant discovery, "I've been watching people in town, and I noticed something important." "What did you notice?" "The families that are happy, like the Pattersons and the Hendersons and the people at church. They all have mamas and papas, and the mamas and papas help each other with the hard things." Rebecca felt her heart clench. "That's true, sweetheart, but—" "And I also noticed," Annie continued with unstoppable logic, "that Mr. Cross looks like he might be good at helping with hard things. He's big and strong, and when he looked at us by the creek, his eyes were, kind, not scary at all." "Annie, what are you trying to say?" Her daughter turned to face her fully, brown eyes bright with conviction. "I think Mr. Cross needs a family, and we need someone to help us keep our house. Maybe they go together like puzzle pieces." The innocence of it took Rebecca's breath away. In Annie's 4-year-old mind, the solution was beautifully simple. Lonely people should find each other, and problems should be solved by bringing the right pieces together. "Sweetheart, life isn't quite that simple. Mr. Cross is a stranger to us. We don't know anything about him." "We know he's honest," Annie said firmly. "Mrs. Holbrook said so. And we know he's been sad for a long time, like you were when Papa went to heaven. Maybe he just needs someone to remind him how to be happy." That night, after putting Annie to bed, Rebecca found herself standing on her front porch, looking up at the mountains where a few scattered lights indicated human habitation. Somewhere up there, Jeremiah Cross was probably sitting by his fire, content in his solitude. Or was he? Annie's words echoed in her mind, along with the memory of how his expression had softened when her daughter spoke to him. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Rebecca was feeding the chickens when she noticed someone approaching on foot, a tall figure moving with the measured pace she now recognized. Her heart began beating faster as Jeremiah Cross came into clear view, carrying what appeared to be a freshly caught trout. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said when he reached the fence that marked her property line, "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Mr. Cross, though I am surprised to see you. I noticed your chicken coop has a broken board," he said, gesturing toward the small structure. "Thought I might offer to fix it if you'd like. No charge, just seemed like something that should be done before winter sets in." Rebecca followed his gaze and saw that he was right. One of the boards had worked loose, creating a gap that would let in cold air and possibly predators. It was the kind of repair she'd been putting off because she lacked both the materials and the skill to do it properly. "That's very kind of you, but I couldn't ask you to." "You didn't ask," he said simply. "I'm offering." Before Rebecca could respond, Annie burst through the front door like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Mr. Cross, you came back!" She ran toward him with the fearless enthusiasm of childhood, stopping just short of the fence. "Did you bring us a fish?" Jeremiah looked down at the trout in his hands, as if he'd forgotten he was carrying it. "I suppose I did. Caught more than I can eat myself. Mama's a very good cook," Annie announced with pride. "She makes the best biscuits in the whole territory." "Annie," Rebecca said with gentle reproach, "Mr. Cross probably has his own cooking to do." But something in Jeremiah's expression made her pause. He was looking at Annie with a mixture of surprise and something else, a warmth that seemed to catch him off guard. "It's been a long time since I've had homemade biscuits," he said quietly, and so it was that Rebecca Fletcher found herself setting an extra place at her table for dinner, while outside her kitchen window, the mountain man who'd forgotten how to be part of anything worked steadily to repair the small breach in her chicken coop's defenses. The chicken coop repair became something of a revelation for all three of them. Rebecca watched through her kitchen window as Jeremiah worked with quiet efficiency, his large hands moving with surprising delicacy as he fitted the new board into place. His tools, she noticed, were all handmade, carved from mountain hardwood and worn smooth by years of use. Each one showed the careful attention of a man who'd learned to depend entirely on his own skill and preparation. What surprised her most was how naturally Annie gravitated toward him. While Rebecca cooked dinner, her daughter stationed herself on the other side of the fence, providing a steady stream of commentary and questions that would have driven most adults to distraction. "Why do you make your own tools instead of buying them from Mr. Kincaid's store?" Annie asked, chin propped on the fence rail. "Sometimes what you need isn't what someone else thinks you should buy," Jeremiah replied, testing the stability of the repaired board. "When you make something yourself, you know exactly how it's going to work, like how Mama makes all my clothes instead of buying them." Jeremiah paused in his work, glancing toward the house where Rebecca was visible through the window. "Something like that, I expect. Mama's very good at making things work," Annie continued with the loyal pride of a daughter. "She fixed our roof all by herself when it leaked last spring. And she taught herself to shoe our horse because Mr. Patterson charges too much money." Rebecca felt her cheeks warm at her daughter's innocent revelations about their financial situation. But when she looked outside, she saw no judgment in Jeremiah's expression, only something that might have been respect. "That's a useful skill," he said simply. "Shows character, being willing to learn hard things." "Would you teach me to make tools someday?" Annie asked with the hopeful enthusiasm that made adults want to promise her the moon. Jeremiah's hands stilled completely. Rebecca held her breath, wondering how he would respond to such an innocent request that carried so much implication about future contact, about relationship, about the possibility that someday might actually arrive. "We'll see," he said finally, which wasn't a yes but wasn't a no either. When the repair was finished, Rebecca invited him inside for dinner. The moment felt significant somehow, crossing a threshold that had nothing to do with the physical door. Jeremiah hesitated on the porch, his eyes taking in the details of a home that bore all the marks of a woman's care: wildflowers in a mason jar on the windowsill, curtains sewn from fabric remnants, the warm glow of lamplight against handmade. "And furniture. Been a long time since I've sat at someone else's table," he said quietly. "Then it's past time you did," Rebecca replied, surprised by her own boldness. The dinner conversation unfolded slowly, like a flower opening to sunlight. Annie chattered about her daily adventures, about the family of rabbits that lived under the front porch, and the way clouds sometimes looked exactly like the animals in her picture book. Rebecca found herself watching Jeremiah's face as her daughter spoke, seeing how his expression gradually softened, how the rigid lines around his eyes began to ease. "Mr. Cross," Annie said suddenly, "do you know any stories?" "What kind of stories?" "Any kind. Mama tells me stories sometimes, but she's heard all of mine already, so they don't surprise her anymore." Jeremiah considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Well, I suppose I know a few things about the mountains, about the animals that live up there." "Oh, yes, please." And so Rebecca found herself clearing away the dinner dishes while listening to Jeremiah tell Annie about a family of mountain goats he'd been observing for several seasons, about their ability to navigate impossible cliff faces and their fierce protection of their young. His voice, rusty from disuse at first, gradually warmed into the rhythm of natural storytelling. "The mother goat," he said. "She'll put herself between her babies and any danger, no matter how big or scary. That's what mothers do. They find strength they didn't know they had when their children need protecting." Rebecca's hands stilled on the dishes. Something in his tone suggested he wasn't just talking about mountain goats, and when she glanced over, she found his dark eyes fixed on her with an understanding that made her breath catch. After dinner, Jeremiah lingered on the porch longer than politeness required. Annie had been tucked into bed with promises of more mountain stories sometime soon, and Rebecca had stepped outside to enjoy the cool evening air. "Thank you for the meal," he said, "and for the company. I'd forgotten how good it feels to hear a child laugh." "You're welcome any time," Rebecca replied, then immediately worried she'd been too forward. But Jeremiah nodded, as if her invitation was exactly what he'd hoped to hear. "The fence along your pasture could use some attention too," he observed. "Few posts are working loose. If you don't mind, I could come back tomorrow and have a look." Rebecca felt something flutter in her chest. Relief, gratitude, and something else she wasn't quite ready to name. "I'd appreciate that more than I can say." No need for appreciation, just neighbors helping neighbors. But they both knew it was more than that, even if neither was ready to speak it aloud. The next morning brought Jeremiah back with a leather tool satchel and a quiet determination to make himself useful. Rebecca watched him survey the fence line with the experienced eye of someone who'd learned to spot potential problems before they became disasters. "This post here," he said, gripping one of the wooden stakes and testing its stability. "Grounds. Shifted some. Winter freeze probably loosened it up. Won't hold if a cow decides to lean against it." "How much would the repair cost?" Rebecca asked, already calculating expenses she couldn't afford. "Time and elbow grease," Jeremiah replied. "Got some cedar posts cut and seasoned. Just need to dig out the old ones and set the new ones proper." As he worked, Rebecca found excuses to be outside, hanging laundry, tending her small vegetable garden, gathering eggs from the chickens. She told herself she was simply managing her household duties, but truthfully, she was fascinated by the methodical way he approached each task, the quiet competence that spoke of a man who'd learned to solve problems without drama or complaint. Annie appointed herself his assistant, following at what she deemed a safe distance while peppering him with questions about everything from fence construction to mountain weather patterns. To Rebecca's amazement, Jeremiah answered each inquiry with the same patient attention he'd shown the night before. "Why do you dig the hole so deep?" Annie wanted to know. "Fence is only as strong as what's hidden underneath," Jeremiah explained, settling a new post into the hole he'd carefully excavated. "Most of the work nobody ever sees. but it's the most important part. Rebecca found herself thinking about that observation long after he'd spoken it. So much of life was like that. The hidden work, the daily choices that nobody witnessed, but that determined whether everything else would hold steady when storms came. By late afternoon, the fence line stood straight and solid, each post plumb and properly braced. Jeremiah packed his tools with the same methodical care he'd shown in using them, but Rebecca noticed he seemed reluctant to leave. "Could I ask you something, Mr. Cross?" she said, as he shouldered his tool satchel. "Of course." "Why? Are you helping us? I mean, truly. We're strangers to you, and this can't be how you plan to spend your time." Jeremiah was quiet for so long that Rebecca wondered if she'd overstepped some invisible boundary. But when he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of complete honesty. "Sometimes a man gets so used to being alone, he forgets there's any other way to be," he said. Then something happens to remind him that maybe alone isn't the same thing as content. His eyes met hers for a moment that stretched between them like a bridge being built. Then he touched the brim of his hat and walked away, leaving Rebecca standing beside her newly repaired fence, wondering if she'd just witnessed the first crack in the wall a lonely man had built around his heart. Over the following week, Jeremiah Cross began appearing at the Fletcher Ranch with the regularity of sunrise. He never announced his visits, simply materialized at whatever task needed attention: clearing a blocked drainage ditch, reinforcing the barn door that had started to sag, splitting firewood for Rebecca's dwindling winter supply. Each project seemed to reveal another that required attention, as if the ranch itself was conspiring to keep him nearby. Rebecca found herself anticipating these visits more than she cared to admit. She began timing her morning coffee to coincide with his arrival, positioning herself on the front porch where she could watch him work while appearing to simply enjoy the mountain air. There was something deeply satisfying about watching competent hands solve problems, about seeing the gradual transformation of her struggling property into something that looked cared for again. Annie had appointed herself Jeremiah's official apprentice, a role she took seriously enough to fashion herself a tool belt from an old leather strap and a collection of wooden spoons. She shadowed his every move, absorbing his quiet lessons about reading the land, understanding the behavior of animals, and the importance of preparing for difficulties before they arrived. "Mr. Cross," she announced one morning while he examined the hinges on the barn door, "I think you should teach me about mountain things." "What kind of mountain things?" he asked, testing the swing of the door with careful attention. "All of them. How to find food that grows wild, and which clouds mean snow is coming, and how to tell if an animal is friendly or not." Jeremiah paused in his work, considering the earnest request. Rebecca, who was hanging laundry nearby, held her breath. Annie's question carried implications that went far beyond simple curiosity. It suggested an expectation of future lessons, of ongoing presence in their lives. "Those are important things to know," he said finally, "especially for someone who lives near the mountains." "Then you'll teach me? I suppose I could show you a few things, but you'd have to listen carefully and follow instructions exactly. Mountain knowledge isn't something to play around with." Annie's face lit up with such pure joy that Rebecca felt her heart squeeze. When was the last time anyone had offered to teach her daughter something valuable, something that went beyond the basic lessons Rebecca could provide herself? That afternoon, Jeremiah took Annie on what he called a short walk around the edges of the ranch property. Rebecca watched them go with mixed feelings, pride in Annie's fearless curiosity, but also a deeper anxiety about how quickly her daughter was bonding with this mysterious man who could disappear back into the mountains at any moment. When they returned an hour later, Annie was practically vibrating with excitement. Mama, look what Mr. Cross showed me." She held up a handful of plants that Rebecca didn't recognize. "This one you can eat when your stomach hurts, and this one makes tea that helps you sleep, and this one, oh, this is the best one, this one you rub on bee stings and they stop hurting right away." Jeremiah stood behind Annie, his expression softer than Rebecca had yet seen it. "She's a natural student," he said quietly, "asks the right questions and remembers what she's told. And Mr. Cross knows everything about everything," Annie continued breathlessly. "He showed me animal tracks. By the creek, rabbit and deer and something called a marten that I've never seen, but he says they're very shy. And he taught me how to tell direction by looking at moss on trees, and how to find water when you can't see a creek anywhere." That evening, after Annie had been tucked into bed with promises of more mountain lessons, Rebecca found herself alone, on the porch with Jeremiah. The conversation that had been building between them for days finally began to emerge. "She's never had a father figure," Rebecca said quietly, her eyes fixed on the distant peaks. "Her papa died when she was barely 2. She doesn't remember him at all." "She's a fine child," Jeremiah replied. "Credit to you for raising her with such spirit. Sometimes I worry I'm not enough, that she needs things I can't give her." Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded in his lap. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of personal experience. "Lost my own family 12 years ago," he said simply. "Wife and little boy. Fever took them both in the space of a week." Rebecca felt her breath catch. She'd heard rumors about his tragedy, but having him speak of it directly felt like being trusted with something precious and fragile. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "After they died, I thought I was done with all of this." He gestured vaguely. "Toward the house, the ranch, the evidence of domestic life. Figured I'd used up my chance at having people to care about. And now?" Jeremiah turned to look at her directly, his dark eyes holding something she couldn't quite name. "Now I'm wondering if maybe I was wrong about that." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken, her practical mind warring with something deeper and more dangerous: hope. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Rebecca's heart sank when she recognized the rider, Douglas Coulter, the wealthy rancher whose marriage proposal still hung over her like a storm cloud. Coulter dismounted with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. He was handsome, in a conventional sense, well-groomed, properly dressed, successful, but something about his smile had always struck Rebecca as calculated rather than warm. "Evening, Rebecca," he said, removing his hat with theatrical courtesy. His eyes flicked to Jeremiah with barely concealed irritation. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Good evening, Douglas," Rebecca replied carefully. "This is Jeremiah Cross. He's been helping with some repairs around the ranch." Coulter's assessment of Jeremiah was swift and dismissive. He saw the homemade clothes, the calloused hands, the quiet demeanor of a man who worked with his back rather than his bank account. "How neighborly," Coulter said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Though I imagine a lady in your position has many pressing concerns that require a more substantial approach." The implication was clear, and Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks. But before she could respond, Jeremiah stood slowly, his full height giving him a considerable advantage over the rancher. "Mrs. Fletcher seems quite capable of managing her concerns," he said quietly. "Just needed a hand with a few things." Coulter's smile became more forced. "Of course, though I'm sure a temporary solution can't address the larger challenges she's facing." The conversation was rapidly becoming a territorial display, and Rebecca knew she needed to intervene before it escalated further. "Douglas, what brings you by this evening?" she asked firmly. "Just wanted to remind you that my offer stands," he said, his attention returning to her. "In fact, I've been thinking we might move up the timeline. No need to wait when practical. Considerations are so pressing." Rebecca felt Jeremiah's attention sharpen beside her, though he remained silent. Annie's voice drifted from inside the house. She was talking to her doll, spinning one of the elaborate stories she loved to create. "I appreciate your concern," Rebecca said carefully, "but I'm not ready to make any decisions yet." "Rebecca," Coulter said, his voice taking on a patronizing edge, "surely you can see that sentiment is a luxury you can't afford. Your daughter needs security, stability. A proper father figure. She has a mother who loves her, Jeremiah said quietly, but with an undertone that made both Rebecca and Coulter turn to look at him. That's more than a lot of children get. The tension stretched between the three adults like a wire under strain. Rebecca found herself caught between gratitude for Jeremiah's support and anxiety about the complications his presence was creating. Coulter remounted his horse with less than his usual grace. "I'll give you a few more days to consider, Rebecca, but practical realities won't wait forever." After he rode away, Rebecca and Jeremiah sat in silence for several minutes. The peaceful mood of their earlier conversation had been shattered, replaced by the uncomfortable awareness of choices that couldn't be postponed indefinitely. "He's not wrong about practical realities," Rebecca said finally. "No," Jeremiah agreed. "But he's wrong about a lot of other things." Rebecca looked at him curiously. Such as thinking that security and love are the same thing. Such as believing that what a child needs most is a proper father figure instead of someone who actually cares about her happiness. The words carried a weight that made Rebecca's heart race. She found herself studying Jeremiah's profile in the lamplight, seeing not just the mountain man who'd wandered into their lives, but someone who might understand what it meant to build a family, based on choice rather than convenience. "Jeremiah," she said softly, "what are we doing here?" He turned to meet her eyes, and in them she saw the same uncertainty and longing that she felt herself. "I wish I knew," he said honestly, "but whatever it is, I'm not ready for it to end." The carved wooden horse appeared on Annie's windowsill 3 days later, as if it had materialized from her dreams. Rebecca found her daughter staring at it in wonder during breakfast, her small fingers tracing the delicate details of the mane and the proud arch of the neck. "Mama, look, someone left me a present." Rebecca examined the little horse with growing amazement. It was beautifully crafted, the kind of work that required both skill and considerable time. The wood had been sanded to silk smoothness, and tiny details, the horse's alert ears, the suggestion of movement in its stance, revealed an artist's eye. "Do you know who might have left this for you?" Rebecca asked, though she already suspected the answer. "I bet it was Mr. Cross," Annie said, with absolute confidence. "He has magic hands that can make anything." That afternoon, when Jeremiah arrived to examine what he'd termed a concerning wobble in the front porch steps, Rebecca was waiting for him with the wooden horse in her hands. "This is extraordinary work," she said without preamble. "When did you find time to carve something so detailed?" Jeremiah paused in unpacking his tools, a flush of color rising in his weathered cheeks. "Evenings get long up in the mountains," he said simply. "Man needs something to keep his hands busy. It's the most beautiful thing Annie has ever owned. She's been carrying it everywhere since she found it." As if summoned by her name, Annie burst through the front door, clutching the wooden horse against her chest. "Mr. Cross, thank you, thank you." She launched herself at his legs with such enthusiasm that he had to steady himself against the porch railing. "Careful there, little one," he said gently, his large hand settling naturally on her head. "Don't want you to get hurt." "I named her Spirit," Annie announced proudly, "because she looks like she's running towards something wonderful." Jeremiah crouched down to Annie's eye level, bringing his weathered face close to her bright one. "That's a fine name for a horse. A horse needs to have spirit to carry someone safely where they need to go. Will you carve me a whole family of horses someday, so Spirit won't be lonely?" The question caught Jeremiah off guard, as Annie's innocent observations often did. Rebecca watched his face carefully, seeing the internal struggle between his growing attachment to her daughter and his fear of making promises he might not be able to keep. "We'll see how things go," he said finally, "one horse at a time." Over the following days, Jeremiah's presence at the ranch became even more integrated into their daily routine. He arrived each morning with the reliability of sunrise, always finding some essential task that required his attention. Rebecca began setting a third place at the breakfast table without being asked, and Annie started each day by showing him whatever new adventure spirit the wooden horse had experienced during the night. But underneath the growing domesticity, tensions were building that none of them could ignore indefinitely. The bank's deadline loomed larger each day, and Douglas Coulter's visits became more frequent and more pressing. He began arriving with small gifts for Annie, store-bought trinkets that paled in comparison to Jeremiah's handcrafted horse, but carried the unmistakable message of a man positioning himself as provider and protector. One morning, Rebecca found herself standing at her kitchen sink, washing dishes while watching Jeremiah teach Annie to identify edible plants in the garden. The scene was so naturally domestic that it made her heart ache. This was what she dreamed of during her marriage, the easy companionship between partners who shared the work of building a life together. But dreams, she reminded herself firmly, didn't pay mortgages or put food on the table. Mrs. Fletcher, Martha Holbrook's voice from the front porch, startled Rebecca from her reverie. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I wanted to speak with you about something." Rebecca dried her hands and went to greet her visitor, wondering what had brought the storekeeper's wife all the way out to the ranch. Martha's expression was kind but serious, the look of someone preparing to deliver news that wouldn't be entirely welcome. "What can I do for you, Martha?" "Well, dear, I'm afraid the whole town is talking about your situation, about Mr. Coulter's proposal, and about the mountain man who's been spending so much time here." Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks. Small-town gossip was as inevitable as weather, but that didn't make it any less uncomfortable when it turned in your direction. "People will talk," she said carefully. "That's their nature. Indeed they will. But Rebecca, honey, I've known you since you came to Millfield, and I've watched you struggle these past 2 years with more courage than most folks could muster. So I'm going to speak plainly, if you don't mind." Rebecca gestured toward the porch. "Chairs. Please sit down." Martha settled herself with the careful attention of someone whose words had been chosen in advance. "Douglas Coulter is a good man, and he's offering you security that's real and immediate. But that mountain man of yours, he's offering you something different, something that might be harder to build, but more satisfying to live with." "He's not my mountain man," Rebecca protested weakly. "Isn't he? Rebecca, I've seen how he looks at you when he thinks nobody's watching, and I've seen how you light up when he's around. That's not something you can find with just anyone." Through the kitchen window, Rebecca could see Jeremiah patiently explaining something to Annie, his head bent close to hers as he pointed out details in a leaf she'd brought him. The sight made something twist in her chest. Longing mixed with terror. "Martha, even if what you're suggesting were possible, I can't afford to make decisions based on feelings. Annie needs a home, food, a future. I can't gamble with her security on the possibility that a man I barely know might what? Love you? Care for your daughter? Work beside you to build something lasting?" Martha's voice was gentle but firm. "Rebecca, some gambles are worth taking, and some aren't. What if I'm wrong about him? What if he decides the responsibility is too much and disappears back into his mountains? I'd lose everything, and Annie would pay the price." Martha was quiet for a moment, watching Annie's animated conversation with Jeremiah through the window. "What if you're wrong about Douglas Coulter? What if marrying for security leaves you and Annie trapped in a life that has everything you need, except the one thing that makes all the rest worthwhile?" Before Rebecca could respond, Annie came running up to the porch with her wooden horse, clutched in one hand and a bundle of plants in the other. "Mama, look what Mr. Cross taught me. These are all good for different things. This one helps cuts heal faster, and this one makes your stomach feel better when you eat too much, and this one—" She paused, noticing Martha for the first time. "Oh, hello, Mrs. Holbrook. Do you want to see my horse? Mr. Cross made her for me with his magic hands." Martha accepted the wooden horse with appropriate admiration, turning it over in her hands to examine the craftsmanship. "This is beautiful work, Annie. Very special indeed. Mr. Cross says he might make her some friends someday, but horses need to earn their herd one at a time. That sounds like very wise advice, Martha said, her eyes meeting Rebecca's with meaningful intent. The best things in life are usually built slowly, with care and patience. After Martha left, Rebecca found herself unable to concentrate on any of her usual tasks. She moved restlessly through the house, folding clothes that didn't need. Folding, reorganizing shelves that were already perfectly arranged. Through the windows, she could see Jeremiah working on the barn door that had been giving them trouble, his movements sure and economical. When Annie went down for her afternoon nap, Rebecca finally worked up the courage to join him outside. She found him examining the doorframe with the focused attention he brought to all his work. The wood's been absorbing moisture, he explained without looking up. Swelling enough to bind against the frame. Need to plane it down a bit, then seal it properly. Jeremiah, she said quietly, can I ask you something personal? He straightened, his dark eyes meeting hers with careful attention. Of course. When you lost your family, after the grief began to ease a little, did you ever think about trying again? About building something new? The question hung between them like a challenge. Jeremiah set down his plane and leaned against the barn wall, his expression thoughtful. For a long time, I thought grief was all I had left of them, he said slowly. Like if I stopped hurting, I'd be forgetting them somehow, dishonoring what we'd had. But you don't feel that way anymore. I'm starting to think maybe the best way to honor what I had is to be grateful it existed at all, and to be open to the possibility that love isn't something you use up. It's something that grows when you share it. Rebecca felt tears threaten at the simple wisdom of his words. I'm scared, Jeremiah, scared of making the wrong choice, scared of taking risks with Annie's future, scared that what I'm feeling might not be real. Jeremiah stepped closer, his hand rising to gently cup her face. What you're feeling is real, Rebecca. I see it in your eyes every time you look at me, same as I feel it in my chest every time I think about leaving here. Then why haven't you said anything? Why haven't we talked about what's happening between us? Because, he said softly, I wanted to be sure I was thinking about what's best for you and Annie, not just what I want for myself. The admission broke something open in Rebecca's chest. Standing there in the afternoon sunlight, with this quiet man's hand against her cheek and the sound of Annie's contented breathing drifting from the house, she felt the first real hope she'd experienced since her husband's death. That evening, after Annie had been tucked into bed with her wooden horse and a story about brave mountain horses who carried their riders safely through storms, Rebecca made a decision that surprised even herself. She climbed the narrow stairs to her bedroom and opened the cedar chest that held her most precious possessions. Her wedding dress lay folded between layers of tissue paper, preserved with the care of someone who believed in the permanence of love. The ivory silk had yellowed, slightly with age, but the delicate pearl buttons and hand-sewn lace remained as beautiful as the day her mother had helped her into it. She lifted the dress carefully, holding it against herself as she stood before the mirror. The woman who looked back at her had changed considerably from the young bride who'd worn this dress 5 years ago. There were lines around her eyes now, calluses on her hands, a steadiness in her posture that came from facing hardship alone. But there was also something new, a softness in her expression that hadn't been there since before her husband's death. She was still standing there, lost in memories and possibilities, when a soft knock at the front door made her heart jump. Folding the dress quickly back into the chest, she hurried downstairs to find Douglas Coulter standing on her porch with his hat in his hands and determination in his eyes. "Douglas," she said, surprised by the late hour of his visit, "is everything all right? May I come in? I need to speak with you about something important." Rebecca hesitated, acutely aware that having an unmarried man in her house after dark would provide enough gossip to fuel Millfield for months. But there was something in Coulter's manner that suggested this conversation wouldn't wait for a more appropriate time. Of course. But please keep your voice down. Annie's sleeping. Coulter stepped into her small parlor, his presence filling the space in a way that felt overwhelming rather than comforting. He was a large man, accustomed to commanding attention and getting his way through the sheer force of his personality. Rebecca, I'll be direct because time is becoming a factor. I know about the bank's deadline. I know exactly how much you owe and exactly how little time you have left to pay it. Rebecca felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with discussions of money and failure. I suppose most of the town knows by now. What most of the town doesn't know, Coulter continued, is that I've been in discussions with Theodore Jameson about purchasing your mortgage directly from the bank. The words hit Rebecca like cold water. What does that mean exactly? It means I can make this entire problem disappear with a single conversation. Your debt, the foreclosure threat, all of it, gone. He moved closer, his voice taking on the persuasive tone of a man making what he considered an irresistible offer. All you have to do is say yes to my proposal. Rebecca sank into her rocking chair, her mind reeling. You'd buy my debt. Consider it a wedding gift, a way of starting our marriage without the cloud of financial worry hanging over us. And if I refuse your proposal? Coulter's expression hardened slightly. Then the bank proceeds with foreclosure. As planned, Rebecca, be reasonable. You have a daughter to think about. The manipulation in his words, using Annie as leverage, sparked something fierce in Rebecca's chest. Don't tell me what I need to consider regarding my daughter, she said quietly but firmly. I'm not trying to manipulate you, Coulter said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. I'm trying to save you from a situation that has no other viable solution. That mountain man you've been entertaining, what exactly do you think he can offer you? A cabin with no running water? A life of isolation and hardship? Before Rebecca could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. He can offer her respect, Jeremiah said from the doorway, and the freedom to choose her own future. Rebecca's heart jumped at the sound of his voice. She hadn't heard him approach, hadn't even known he was still on the property. But there he stood, his quiet presence filling the room with a different kind of authority than Coulter's bluster. This is a private conversation, Coulter said, his voice sharp with irritation. Didn't sound private from outside, Jeremiah replied, calmly. Sounded like a man trying to back a woman into a corner. You have no idea what you're talking about, mountain man. This is about practical realities, security, stability, a future for that little girl upstairs. A future built on what? Jeremiah asked, stepping fully into the room. Fear? Obligation? The idea that a woman should be grateful for any offer, regardless of whether it comes with love or just convenience. Coulter's face flushed red. And what are you offering? Poetry about mountain sunsets and the romance of poverty? I'm not offering anything, Jeremiah said quietly, his eyes finding Rebecca's across the room. That's not my choice to make. It's hers. The simple statement hit Rebecca with more force than all of Coulter's arguments combined. Here was a man who understood that her agency, her right to choose her own path, was more valuable than any financial security he could provide. Rebecca, Coulter pressed, you're not thinking clearly. Sentiment is a luxury you can't afford. Maybe, Rebecca said slowly, rising from her chair with new determination, sentiment is the only thing I can afford, the only thing that makes the rest worthwhile. Coulter stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. You're making a mistake that will cost your daughter her future. No, Rebecca said firmly. I'm making a choice that will show my daughter that her future should be built on love and respect, not fear and obligation. The silence that followed stretched taut between them. Coulter looked from Rebecca to Jeremiah, and back again, finally understanding that his carefully constructed pressure campaign had backfired spectacularly. You'll regret this, he said, settling his hat back on his head. When you're losing this house and have nowhere to go, you'll remember that I offered you a solution. And you'll remember, Jeremiah said quietly as Coulter headed for the door. that she chose freedom over security and love over convenience. That takes more courage than most people ever find. After Coulter's horse disappeared into the darkness, Rebecca and Jeremiah stood on the porch in the soft light spilling from the house. The conversation that had been building between them for weeks finally began in earnest. "I don't know what I'm doing," Rebecca said honestly. "I don't know how to choose between my heart and my daughter's security." "Maybe," Jeremiah suggested. Gently, they're not opposing choices. Maybe your daughter's real security comes from watching her mother choose love when it's offered honestly. But what if love isn't enough? What if I'm being selfish, putting my feelings ahead of her practical needs? Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the mountains where his solitary life waited like an old coat he could slip back into if necessary. "My boy was about Annie's age when he died," he said finally, "and in the time I had with him, I learned something important. Children don't need perfect circumstances. They need parents who love them enough to fight for what's right, even when it's hard. What's right in this situation? That's something only you can decide. But I'll tell you this. If you choose me, choose us, it won't be because you have no other options. It'll be because you believe we can build something together that's worth more than what either of us could have alone." Rebecca felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were the tears that come when hope finally wins its battle against fear. "Jeremiah," she whispered, "I'm choosing you. I'm choosing us. Whatever comes after, whatever we have to face, I want to face it together." He stepped closer then, his weathered hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. "Then we'll face it together," he said simply. "All of it. The good and the bad. And everything in between." When he kissed her, soft and sure under the Wyoming stars, Rebecca felt something she'd thought was lost forever, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The letter was hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Jeremiah's cabin, wrapped in oiled cloth and tucked away like a secret too precious to expose to light. He'd been searching for his winter coat, preparing for an early cold snap that had caught the mountains off guard when his fingers brushed against the familiar packet. For 12 years, he'd managed to avoid opening it. For 12 years, he'd told himself that Sarah's final words were meant to comfort him in his dying moments, not to guide him through the long years of living that followed. But now, with Rebecca's kiss still warming his memory and Annie's laughter echoing in his thoughts, he found himself sitting on his cabin floor with trembling hands, carefully unfolding the letter his wife had pressed into his palm during her final lucid hour. "My dearest Jeremiah, if you're reading this, then I am gone, and you have survived the fever that's taken our boy and is taking me. I need you to know that I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of what will happen to you after I'm gone. You have the biggest, gentlest heart of any man I've ever known, but you also have the strongest will. I'm afraid you'll use that will to lock your heart away, to convince yourself that loving me and Tommy was enough for one lifetime. I'm afraid you'll choose loneliness over the risk of losing someone again. Please don't do that, my love. Please don't make our love a prison that keeps you from living. I know you can't imagine it now, but someday you'll meet a woman who needs what you have to give. Maybe she'll have children who need a father's steady hand. Maybe she'll be struggling with burdens too heavy for one person to carry. When that day comes, and you'll know it when it arrives, I want you to remember that love is not something we hoard against loss. It's something we share because we can. The love you gave me and Tommy doesn't disappear when we do. It becomes part of who you are, part of what you have to offer the next person who needs it. The best way to honor what we had is not to guard it jealously, but to let it teach you how to love again. I release you, Jeremiah, from guilt, from obligation, from the idea that moving forward means leaving us behind. Take what we taught you about love and use it to build something beautiful with someone new. Your devoted wife, Sarah. The letter fell from Jeremiah's hands as 12 years of carefully constructed walls crumbled around him. He'd been wrong, catastrophically, painfully wrong, about what Sarah would have wanted for him. He'd turned her love into a monument to his own suffering when she'd meant it to be a foundation for new happiness. The walk down to Rebecca's ranch took him twice as long as usual, not because he was reluctant to arrive, but because he needed time to understand the magnitude of what had just shifted in his world. The guilt that had driven him into isolation hadn't been honoring Sarah's memory. It had been betraying her final wish. He found Rebecca in her vegetable garden, harvesting the last of the summer squash before the threatened frost could claim them. She looked up at his approach, and her smile faltered when she saw his expression. "Jeremiah, what's wrong?" Instead of answering immediately, he pulled the letter from his coat pocket and held it out to her, with hands that still trembled slightly. "I found something today," he said quietly. "Something I should have found 12 years ago." Rebecca wiped her hands on her apron before accepting the letter, her eyes moving quickly over Sarah's careful script. As she read, Jeremiah watched her face transform, first with understanding, then with something that looked like wonder. "Oh, Jeremiah," she whispered when she'd finished reading. "She loved you so much." "I thought I was honoring her memory by staying alone," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought that's what she would have wanted." "She wanted you to be happy," Rebecca said simply. "She wanted you to live, not just survive. I've wasted so much time." Rebecca stepped closer, the letter still clutched in her hands. "Not wasted. You needed that time to heal, to become the man you are now, the man she knew you could be." From inside the house came the sound of Annie's voice, singing one of the nonsense songs she invented while playing with her wooden horse. The sound seemed to crystallize something for Jeremiah, focusing his scattered emotions into clear purpose. "Rebecca," he said, taking her hands in his, "I want to ask you something. And I want you to know that this letter doesn't change what I'm feeling. It just finally gives me permission to feel it." Before he could continue, the sound of multiple horses approaching made them both turn toward the road. Rebecca's heart sank when she recognized Theodore Jameson from the bank, accompanied by two men she didn't know, one wearing a badge that identified him as a territorial marshal. "Mrs. Fletcher," Jameson called out as they dismounted, "I'm afraid we have some unpleasant business to conduct." "What kind of business?" Jeremiah asked, stepping protectively closer to Rebecca. "Foreclosure proceedings," the marshal replied, consulting an official-looking document. "This property is to be vacated within 24 hours to allow for auction." Rebecca felt the world tilt around her. "But you said I had 30 days. "That was before Mr. Coulter's involvement," Jameson interrupted with false sympathy. "He's accelerated the timeline considerably. As the new holder of your mortgage, he has the right to demand immediate settlement." "Coulter bought the mortgage?" Jeremiah's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Yesterday morning," Jameson confirmed. "Perfectly legal transaction. And as the new creditor, he's chosen to exercise his right to immediate foreclosure rather than extend the grace period." The manipulation was breathtaking in its ruthlessness. Coulter had played his final card. If Rebecca wouldn't accept his proposal willingly, he'd force her into a position where she'd have no choice but to turn to him for salvation. "Where's Mr. Coulter now?" Rebecca asked, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling in her mind. "At the territorial office, filing the necessary paperwork," the marshal replied. "Though he did ask me to give you this message. His offer of marriage still stands and would immediately resolve this unfortunate situation." Annie appeared in the doorway, attracted by the sound of unfamiliar voices. She took in the serious faces of the adults, the official papers in the marshal's hands, and her mother's pale expression with the intuitive understanding that children possess for detecting crisis. "Mama," she said uncertainly, clutching her wooden horse against her chest. "Are the serious men here about our house?" The innocent question broke something open in Rebecca's chest. She knelt down to Annie's level, struggling to find words that would explain the incomprehensible. "Yes, sweetheart. There are some complications with our house. Are we going to have to move away?" Before Rebecca could answer, Jeremiah stepped forward with a calm authority that surprised everyone present, including himself. "Marshal," he said quietly, "I'd like to examine those documents if you don't mind." The marshal handed over the papers with professional courtesy. Jeremiah studied them carefully, his weathered fingers tracing the legal language with more understanding than his mountain man appearance might suggest. "These foreclosure papers are dated yesterday," he observed, "but the mortgage transfer document is dated today. How can you foreclose on a mortgage that wasn't legally transferred until after the foreclosure was initiated?" Jameson's confident expression flickered with uncertainty. Well, the papers were prepared in advance, which means the foreclosure order is invalid," Jeremiah continued with growing confidence. "You can't foreclose on behalf of a creditor who didn't actually own the debt at the time the order was filed." The marshal examined the documents more carefully, his brow furrowing as he noticed the date discrepancy that Jeremiah had spotted. "He's right," he said slowly. "This is a procedural error. The foreclosure order will have to be refiled with corrected dates." "How long will that take?" Rebecca asked, hope beginning to flutter in her chest. "At least a week, possibly 2, depending on how backed up the territorial office is with paperwork." After the men left, Rebecca turned to Jeremiah with amazement and gratitude shining in her eyes. "How did you know to look for that?" "My father was a lawyer back in Missouri," Jeremiah said simply. "Before I came west, he made sure I understood contracts and legal documents, said it might save me trouble someday." "You've never mentioned that before." "Haven't mentioned a lot of things. Figured my past didn't matter much when I was planning to live alone forever." Annie had been listening to this exchange with the serious attention she brought to important adult conversations. Now she tugged at Jeremiah's coat and looked up at him with absolute trust. "Mr. Cross, are you going to help us keep our house?" Jeremiah knelt down to her level, his dark eyes gentle but honest. "I'm going to try, Annie, but it's going to take more than just finding mistakes in legal papers. What else will it take?" "It'll take all of us working together, and maybe a little bit of the kind of courage your mama showed when she chose love over fear." That evening, after Annie had been tucked into bed with extra reassurances about her safety and security, Rebecca and Jeremiah sat on the porch making plans that would have seemed impossible just days before. "There might be a way," Jeremiah said, thoughtfully. "I've got money saved up in the mountains, gold dust mostly from panning over the years. Never had much use for it before, but now—" "How much money?" Rebecca asked carefully. "Enough to buy your mortgage from Coulter if he's willing to sell, and enough left over to make improvements to the ranch, buy better stock, maybe expand the operation." Rebecca stared at him in the lamplight, trying to process what he was telling her. "You've been living like a hermit in the mountains while sitting on enough gold to buy property. Didn't see the point in spending money on things I didn't need. And I didn't need anything until I met you and Annie. Jeremiah, I can't let you spend your life savings on our problems." "Our problems," he corrected gently. "If we're going to be a family, then these become our problems to solve together." The word family hung in the air between them, golden and precious as the dust Jeremiah had been collecting in the mountains for 12 years without knowing why. "Is that what we're going to be?" Rebecca asked softly. "A family?" Instead of answering. With words, Jeremiah reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft leather. When he unfolded the cloth, Rebecca gasped at what she saw. A ring carved from mountain jade, delicate and beautiful, clearly the work of the same skilled hands that had created Annie's wooden horse. "I started working on this the day after Annie. Asked me if I got lonely," he said quietly. "Didn't admit to myself what I was making, but my hands seemed to know before my heart did." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the ring, simple, handmade, perfect in its imperfection. It was nothing like the expensive diamond Coulter would have offered, but it was infinitely more precious because it represented not wealth, but devotion, not obligation, but choice. "Rebecca Fletcher," Jeremiah said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Will you marry me? Will you let me be a father to Annie and a partner to you in whatever comes next?" "Yes," Rebecca whispered. Then louder, with joy breaking through her tears. "Yes, Jeremiah Cross, yes to all of it." As he slipped the jade ring onto her finger, Rebecca felt the last of her fears dissolve. Tomorrow they would face Coulter together. Tomorrow they would begin the complex work of building a legal and financial foundation for their future. But tonight, under the Wyoming stars, with Sarah's letter tucked safely in the house and Annie sleeping peacefully upstairs, they had found their way to the beginning of something beautiful. The mountain man who had forgotten how to love had remembered. The widow who had been afraid to hope had found courage. And somewhere in the house behind them, a 4-year-old girl slept peacefully, holding a wooden horse named Spirit, the first gift from the father she'd been waiting for all her life. The morning after their engagement brought a flurry of activity that transformed Rebecca's quiet ranch into something resembling a military camp preparing for battle. Jeremiah had risen before dawn to make the treacherous journey up to his mountain. Cash, returning with leather pouches heavy with gold dust and nuggets, the accumulated wealth of 12 years of solitary prospecting. Rebecca spread the contents of the pouches across her kitchen table, her eyes wide with amazement at the fortune that had been hidden in the mountains while she'd struggled to make ends meet in the valley below. "This is more money than I've seen in my entire life," she whispered, running her fingers through the gleaming dust. "Are you certain you want to risk all of this?" "I'm not risking it," Jeremiah replied firmly. "I'm investing it in our future, in Annie's security, in the life we're going to build together." Annie sat at the table with them, her wooden horse positioned carefully beside her breakfast plate, watching the adults count and measure and plan with the serious attention of someone who understood that important things were happening. "Is this enough money to keep our house?" she asked, her small finger tracing patterns in a small pile of gold dust. "It should be more than enough," Jeremiah assured her. "But we need to be smart about how we use it." The first step was a trip to town, the three of them together in Rebecca's wagon with the precious gold secured in Jeremiah's leather satchel. Word of their engagement had somehow preceded them, small towns being what they were, and Rebecca noticed the curious glances and whispered conversations that followed their progress down Main Street. At the bank, Theodore Jameson's welcome was considerably less warm than it had been during his previous visits to the ranch. He examined Jeremiah with the calculating attention of a man reassessing his assumptions about mountain hermits and their potential resources. "Mr. Cross," he said with forced civility, "I understand you wish to discuss Mrs. Fletcher's mortgage situation." "I want to discuss purchasing it," Jeremiah corrected calmly. "The full amount, plus penalties and interest, to be paid in gold at current market rates." Jameson's eyes widened at the implications of such a transaction. "I'm afraid that's not possible. Mr. Coulter now holds the mortgage, and he's expressed no interest in selling." "Then perhaps we should speak with Mr. Coulter directly," Rebecca suggested. "I'm afraid he's not available for meetings today. He's attending to other business matters." The evasion was transparent, and Jeremiah felt his patience beginning to wear thin. "Then perhaps you could send word that we'll be waiting for him at the territorial office. I imagine he'll make time for us when he realizes what's at stake." The territorial office occupied a weathered building at the end of Main Street, its official status marked by a flag that hung limp in the still morning air. Inside, they found a clerk who confirmed their suspicions. Coulter had indeed spent the morning filing new foreclosure paperwork, but he'd left town immediately afterward. "Said he had business in Cheyenne," the clerk informed them. "Mentioned he wouldn't be back for several days." The delay was clearly intentional, designed to let anxiety and desperation do Coulter's work for him. But as they stood on the steps of the territorial office weighing their options, an unexpected ally appeared. "Mrs. Fletcher? Mr. Cross?" "Homer." Kincaid approached from across the street, his expression both concerned and determined. "Might I have a word with you both?" They followed him to the relative privacy of his hardware store, where Homer closed the door and turned to face them with the gravity of someone delivering news that couldn't wait. "I've been hearing things around town," he said without preamble, "about Coulter's plans, about what he's trying to do to your family. And I want you to know that there are folks here who don't approve of his methods." "What kind of things have you been hearing?" Jeremiah asked. "He's been talking to anyone who'll listen about how he's going to save Rebecca from the mistake of marrying beneath her station. Says once he controls the ranch, he'll make sure you understand that mountain men aren't welcome in civilized society." Rebecca felt anger flare in her chest. "He can't control who I marry by manipulating financial documents. Maybe not legally." Homer agreed, "but he can make life mighty uncomfortable for folks who don't see things his way. He's got influence in this territory, connections in Cheyenne and Denver, the kind of man who doesn't forget slights and doesn't forgive folks who cross him." "Are you trying to discourage us?" Jeremiah asked quietly. "Just the opposite," Homer replied with a smile that transformed his usually serious face. "I'm trying to tell you that you're not facing this alone." Over the next hour, Homer revealed the existence of something Rebecca had never suspected, a network of mutual support among the town's residents that operated quietly beneath the surface of daily life. The storekeeper had spent the morning visiting with other business owners, farmers, and working families, and the consensus was clear. Douglas Coulter's attempt to force Rebecca into marriage through financial manipulation had crossed a line that the community wouldn't tolerate. "Martha Holbrook has been organizing the women," Homer explained. "They're planning to make it clear that any business establishment that supports Coulter's tactics won't be getting their custom. And the men, well, let's just say there are quite a few of us who remember what it's like to struggle, and we don't appreciate seeing a widow and child threatened by someone with more money than decency." The revelation that the community was rallying to their defense filled Rebecca with a warmth that had nothing to do with the September sun streaming through Homer's windows. She'd spent so long feeling isolated in her struggles that she'd forgotten what it meant to be part of something larger than herself. But community support, while precious, wouldn't solve the immediate legal problem. They still needed to find a way to negotiate with Coulter, and his absence from town suggested he was in no hurry to make that easy. "There might be another approach," Jeremiah said thoughtfully. "If Coulter won't come to us, maybe we need to go to him." "He's in Cheyenne," Rebecca pointed out. "That's a 3-day ride each way, and we don't even know where he's staying." "I might be able to help with that," Homer interjected. "My brother runs a hotel there, the Frontier House on Central Avenue. He keeps track of who's in town, especially folks with money to spend. I could send a telegram, find out where Coulter's staying." While Homer worked his connections, Rebecca and Jeremiah spent the afternoon making practical preparations for what was beginning to feel like a campaign rather than a simple business transaction. They arranged for Martha Holbrook to care for Annie during their absence, packed provisions for the journey, and discussed strategy for the confrontation that awaited them in Cheyenne. "What if he refuses to negotiate?" Rebecca asked as they worked together to prepare their travel supplies. "What if he's so determined to force me into marriage that no amount of money will change his mind?" "Then we'll find another way," Jeremiah replied with quiet confidence. "There's always another way when you're fighting for something that matters." As evening approached, Homer returned with news from his brother. Coulter was indeed in Cheyenne, registered at the Grand Central Hotel, and apparently conducting meetings with territorial officials and potential investors. The implication was clear. He was building political and financial alliances that would make him even more difficult to oppose. "We need to leave tonight," Jeremiah decided. "Travel by moonlight, and get there before he has time to shore up whatever advantage he's trying to build. That evening, as they made their final preparations, Annie sat on her mother's bed, watching Rebecca pack a small traveling bag. The 4-year-old had been unusually quiet all day, absorbing the tension and urgency that surrounded the adults' activities. "Mama," she said finally, "are you and Mr. Cross going to fight the bad man?" Rebecca sat down beside her daughter, choosing her words carefully. "We're going to talk to him, sweetheart. We're going to try to make him understand that what he's doing isn't right. What if he doesn't listen? Then we'll find another way to solve the problem. But Annie, I need you to know something very important. No matter what happens, you're safe. Mr. Cross and I will make sure of that." Annie nodded solemnly, then climbed into Rebecca's lap with the complete trust that children reserve for the adults they know will protect them. "I drew a picture for you to take with you," she said, producing a folded piece of paper from her pocket. Rebecca unfolded the drawing to find a remarkably detailed portrait of their new family. Herself, Jeremiah, and Annie standing in front of their house with the mountains rising behind them. At the bottom, in Annie's careful printing, were the words, "Our happy family." "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Rebecca whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "Perfect. It's so you won't forget what you're fighting for," Annie said with the wisdom that sometimes surprised the adults in her life. As the moon rose over the Wyoming Territory, Rebecca and Jeremiah began their journey to Cheyenne, carrying with them a 4-year-old's drawing, a mountain man's lifetime savings, and the determination of two people who had found love worth fighting for. The Grand Central Hotel in Cheyenne was the kind of establishment that announced its importance through marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and doormen who assessed visitors' worthiness with a single glance. Rebecca felt distinctly out of place in her practical traveling dress, but Jeremiah moved through the opulent lobby with the calm confidence of a man who'd learned not to be intimidated by displays of wealth. They found Douglas Coulter in the hotel's dining room, holding court at a corner table with 2 men in expensive suits who had the calculating air of investors or politicians. He looked up at their approach with surprise that quickly transformed into irritation. "Rebecca, I didn't expect to see you here." "We need to talk, Douglas," Rebecca said firmly, ignoring the curious glances from nearby diners. "I'm in the middle of a business meeting," Coulter replied dismissively. "Perhaps we could arrange something for later in the week." "This won't wait," Jeremiah interjected, his quiet voice carrying enough authority to make Coulter's companions glance at him with new interest. One of the men, a silver-haired gentleman with politician written in every line of his bearing, leaned forward with amusement. "Douglas, aren't you going to introduce your friends?" Coulter's jaw tightened with barely suppressed anger. "Rebecca Fletcher and her associate from Millfield. Nothing that concerns our business here." "Actually," Rebecca said, stepping closer to the table, "our business is exactly why we're here. Mr. Coulter has been manipulating legal documents to try to force me into marriage. I thought his business associates might be interested to know what kind of man they're dealing with." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a badly tended fire. The silver-haired man's expression shifted from amusement to sharp attention, while his companion, a younger man with the lean look of a lawyer, began studying Coulter with new intensity. "That's a serious allegation, Douglas," the silver-haired man said quietly. "It's completely false," Coulter snapped, rising from his chair. "Mrs. Fletcher is obviously distraught about her financial situation. She's not thinking clearly." "Then, perhaps," Jeremiah said calmly, producing a leather folder from his coat, "you'd like to explain these documents we obtained from the territorial office." The folder contained copies of all the paperwork related to Rebecca's mortgage, the original loan, the transfer to Coulter, and the improperly dated foreclosure orders. Jeremiah spread them across the table with methodical precision, pointing out the date discrepancies and procedural irregularities that revealed Coulter's manipulation. The lawyer examined the documents with professional thoroughness, his expression growing grimmer with each page. "Douglas," he said finally, "these dates don't make sense. You can't initiate foreclosure proceedings before you actually own the mortgage. A clerical error, Coulter said weakly. Easily corrected. A clerical error that happens to benefit you while putting pressure on Mrs. Fletcher to accept your marriage proposal. The silver-haired man's voice carried the skepticism of someone well-versed in recognizing corruption. That's quite a coincidence. Rebecca felt a surge of hope as she watched Coulter's carefully constructed facade begin to crumble. But her optimism was premature. Coulter had not achieved his position by giving up easily when cornered. "Gentlemen," he said, recovering some of his composure, "I think you're misunderstanding the situation. Mrs. Fletcher owes a substantial sum of money that she cannot repay. I've offered her a solution that would benefit both of us. If she prefers to face foreclosure rather than accept help, that's her choice." "Help!" Rebecca's voice sharpened with anger. "You call manipulating legal documents and threatening my daughter's security help? I call it practical assistance for a woman who's clearly in over her head," Coulter replied coldly. "A widow with a small child has no business trying to run a ranch alone." The condescension in his tone was so blatant that even his business associates looked uncomfortable. But it was Jeremiah's response that cut through the tension with surgical precision. "You're right," he said quietly, causing everyone at the table to turn toward him in surprise. "A widow with a small child shouldn't have to run a ranch alone. That's why she won't be alone anymore." Before Coulter could respond, Jeremiah reached into his coat and withdrew the leather satchel containing their gold. He set it on the table, with a soft thump that somehow managed to sound like a gauntlet being thrown down. $850, he announced calmly. "The full amount of Mrs. Fletcher's mortgage, plus interest and penalties, in gold at current market rates." The satchel's contents glittered in the dining room's lamplight, each nugget and grain of dust representing years of solitary labor in the mountains. The sight of such wealth, produced without explanation from a man who looked like he'd be more comfortable around a campfire than a conference table, stunned everyone present into silence. "Where did you—" Coulter began, then stopped himself, clearly realizing that the source of the gold was less important than its existence. "The question isn't where I got it," Jeremiah said evenly. "The question is whether you're willing to accept payment for the mortgage and end this harassment of Mrs. Fletcher and her daughter." Coulter stared at the gold with naked longing warring against wounded pride. His carefully laid plans were crashing down around him, destroyed by a mountain man's hidden fortune and a widow's refusal to be intimidated. "This isn't over," he said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Actually," the silver-haired man interjected with the authority of someone accustomed to having his words carry weight, "I think it is." The silver-haired man's intervention carried the weight of unquestionable authority. He stood slowly, his movement deliberate and commanding, and Rebecca realized she was witnessing the kind of political power that could reshape territories with a word. "Douglas," the man continued, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow student, "I believe you've misunderstood the nature of our potential partnership. I'm looking to invest in enterprises run by people of integrity and sound judgment. What I've witnessed today suggests you lack both qualities." Coulter's face flushed red as he realized his business prospects were evaporating along with his romantic ambitions. "Senator Harrison, surely you can see that this is a personal matter. Personal matters have a way of revealing character." Senator Harrison replied coolly, "And character is the foundation of every successful business relationship." The lawyer, who had been quietly organizing the mortgage documents into a neat stack, looked up with professional detachment. "From a legal standpoint, Mr. Coulter, you have two choices. Accept Mr. Cross's payment and transfer the mortgage cleanly, or face questions about your document manipulation from the Territorial Attorney General's office." The threat was politely delivered but unmistakably real. Coulter found himself trapped between financial loss and potential criminal charges, with his reputation crumbling in front of witnesses who controlled his future prospects. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "I'll accept your payment. But understand this, you've made an enemy today, Cross. I don't forget people who interfere with my affairs." "Neither do I," Jeremiah replied calmly, his dark eyes meeting Coulter's with steady resolve. "But the difference is, I don't go looking for trouble with folks who've done me no harm." The financial transaction was completed with cold efficiency. Senator Harrison's lawyer drew up the necessary papers, transferring the mortgage from Coulter to Jeremiah, while Rebecca watched her debt disappear with the stroke of a pen and the transfer of gold that had been hidden in the mountains for 12 years. As Coulter prepared to leave, his business associates having already distanced themselves from him, he turned back to Rebecca with a final attempt at inflicting damage. "You think you've won something here," he said bitterly. "But what happens when your mountain man gets tired of playing house? What happens when he realizes that being responsible for a woman and child isn't as romantic as he thought?" The attack was designed to plant seeds of doubt that would grow in Rebecca's mind long after the immediate crisis had passed. But instead of uncertainty, she felt only a calm certainty that surprised her with its strength. "Then we'll face that together," she said simply, "the same way we've faced everything else." After Coulter's departure, Senator Harrison approached their table with renewed interest. "Mr. Cross, Mrs. Fletcher, I hope you'll forgive my earlier assumptions. I'm curious about your plans for the ranch." What followed was an unexpected conversation about land use, cattle breeding, and the economic potential of small ranching operations in the Wyoming Territory. Senator Harrison, it turned out, was genuinely interested in supporting sustainable agricultural development, and Jeremiah's combination of practical experience and mountain wisdom impressed him considerably. "If you're interested in expanding your operation," the senator said, producing an elegant card from his vest pocket, "I might be able to help with access to markets and transportation agreements. The territory needs more people like you, folks who understand that real prosperity comes from working with the land, not just taking from it." The return journey to Millfield felt like a victory parade, though their only audience was the vast Wyoming landscape that stretched endlessly under September skies. Rebecca rode beside Jeremiah in comfortable silence, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find this was all a dream," she said finally. "Which part? The gold, the ranch, or the engagement?" "All of it. Especially the part where a 4-year-old girl's matchmaking scheme actually worked." Jeremiah laughed, a sound Rebecca had heard rarely but was learning to treasure. "Annie's going to be insufferably proud of herself when she hears how this turned out. She has every right to be. None of this would have happened if she hadn't marched up to you by that creek and announced that we needed each other." They arrived home as the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that seemed to celebrate their return. Annie rushed from Martha Holbrook's house the moment she spotted their wagon, her wooden horse clutched in one hand and her face bright with anticipation. "Did you win?" she called out before they'd even fully stopped. "Did you save our house?" "We did better than that," Rebecca said, lifting her daughter into a fierce embrace. "We saved our family." That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table, sharing the details of their adventure with Annie, carefully edited for 4-year-old sensibilities, Jeremiah produced a small object from his pocket that made both females gasp with delight. "I and thought Spirit might be lonely," he said, setting a second wooden horse beside the first. This one was slightly smaller, carved with the same loving attention to detail, but with a flowing mane that suggested youth and playfulness. "A baby horse," Annie breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. "Spirit has a baby. Every family needs to grow," Jeremiah said quietly, his eyes finding Rebecca's across the table. "And every parent needs to know their children are safe and loved." As Annie played with her expanding wooden herd, Rebecca felt the final pieces of her new life settling into place. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, running the ranch, blending their lives together, learning to be a family of three instead of a mother and daughter alone. But tonight, in the lamplight of her kitchen, with the man she loved and the daughter who'd brought them together, Rebecca knew she was exactly where she belonged. 6 months later, the Fletcher ranch looked like a different place entirely. The improvements had been gradual but transformative. New fencing that stood straight and strong, a renovated barn with a solid roof, and a chicken coop that no longer leaked cold air during winter storms. The changes reflected not just Jeremiah's practical skills and invested resources, but the care that comes when a place transforms from property to home. The wedding had taken place on a crisp October morning, with the entire town of Millfield gathered in the small church that served the community's spiritual needs. Annie had insisted on being the flower girl, a role she'd approached with the same serious dedication she brought to all important tasks. She'd walked down the aisle scattering wildflowers with ceremonial precision, her wooden horses tucked carefully in her dress pockets for moral support. Rebecca had worn her mother's dress, altered and updated, but carrying the same promise of enduring love that had blessed the previous generation. When Jeremiah slipped the jade wedding ring onto her finger, now accompanied by a simple gold band he'd crafted from his mountain treasure, she felt the completion of a circle that had begun with a 4-year-old's bold proposal by a creek. The community's acceptance of their unusual courtship had been wholehearted and enthusiastic. Martha Holbrook had organized the wedding feast with the efficiency of a military campaign, while Homer Kincaid had provided the lumber for building additions to the house that would accommodate their growing family. Even the territorial officials had attended, including Senator Harrison, whose presence had given their union a stamp of approval that resonated throughout the region. Now, as spring returned to the Wyoming Territory, Rebecca stood in her garden, watching Jeremiah teach Annie advanced lessons in mountaincraft. At 5, she had absorbed his teachings with remarkable aptitude, learning to read weather patterns in cloud formations and track animals by their subtle signs. More importantly, she had blossomed under the steady presence of a father who listened to her questions with genuine interest and answered them with the patience of someone who understood that a child's curiosity was precious and deserving of respect. "Mama!" Annie called out, interrupting Rebecca's reverie. "Come see what Papa Jeremiah taught me." The title had evolved naturally over the months, reflecting Annie's understanding that while her birth father would always hold a place in their family story, Jeremiah had earned the right to be called Papa through daily acts of love and devotion. Rebecca approached to find her daughter demonstrating a complex knot that Jeremiah used for securing loads during mountain travel. "That's very impressive, sweetheart," Rebecca said, genuinely amazed at the intricacy of Annie's work. "Papa says, knowing how to tie proper knots might save my life someday," Annie replied, with the gravity of someone sharing crucial survival information. "And he's teaching me to whittle wood without cutting my fingers." Rebecca glanced at Jeremiah, who was watching Annie's demonstration with the proud expression of a father whose child had mastered a difficult skill. The transformation in him over the past months had been as dramatic as the changes to the ranch. The careful guardedness that had defined his interactions with the world had melted away, replaced by the natural warmth of a man who had remembered how to be part of a family. "Speaking of learning new things," Jeremiah said, his tone carrying a hint of the mischief that Rebecca had discovered lurked beneath his serious exterior, "I've got something to show both my girls." He led them to the corral where their horses grazed in the afternoon sunshine, but Rebecca's attention was immediately captured by an addition that hadn't been there that morning. A small pony with a gentle disposition and intelligent eyes, perfectly sized for a young rider. "Oh!" Annie gasped, her hands flying to her cheeks in the dramatic expression of surprise she'd perfected. "Is she for me?" "Well," Jeremiah said seriously, "she needs someone to take care of her, and someone who's learned enough about horses to be a responsible owner. Do you think you know anyone who might qualify? Annie's response was to launch herself at Jeremiah's legs with such enthusiasm that he nearly lost his balance. "Thank you, Papa. Thank you, thank you, thank you," as Rebecca watched her daughter meet her new pony, a mare they would eventually name Hope. After much serious deliberation, she felt the deep contentment that comes when life exceeds even the most optimistic expectations. The struggles of the previous year felt like events from another lifetime, distant memories that served mainly to highlight how much they had all grown and changed. That evening, after Annie had been tucked into bed with detailed plans for tomorrow's riding lessons, Rebecca and Jeremiah sat on their porch in the comfortable silence that had become their favorite form of conversation. The ranch spread out before them in the gathering twilight, peaceful and prosperous, a testament to what could be built when love was given the chance to take root and grow. "Do you ever miss it?" Rebecca asked softly. "The solitude, the simplicity of just caring for yourself?" Jeremiah considered the question with the thoughtfulness he brought to all important matters. "Sometimes I miss the quiet," he said finally. "But I've learned there's a difference between peaceful quiet and lonely quiet. What we have here, the sounds of Annie playing, the noise you make in the kitchen, even the way you hum when you're hanging laundry, that's the kind of music I didn't know I was missing." Rebecca leaned against his shoulder, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. "Annie asked me yesterday if we were going to have more children. What did you tell her?" "I told her that families grow in their own time, in their own way, but that whatever happens, she'll always be our first child, the one who brought us together." "She's going to make a fine big sister someday," Jeremiah observed with quiet confidence. As if summoned by their conversation, Annie appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, her wooden horses clutched in one hand and a serious expression on her face. "I can't sleep," she announced. "I keep thinking about Hope and wondering if she's lonely in the corral." Rebecca and Jeremiah exchanged the kind of look that parents develop, part amusement, part understanding, part recognition that their daughter's empathy was both a gift and a responsibility they needed to nurture carefully. "Would it help if you knew that horses are used to sleeping outside?" Jeremiah asked gently. "And that Hope has been waiting her whole life for a family to love her, just like you were waiting." For a papa, Annie considered this wisdom while absently stroking the mane of her carved horse. "Are you happy, Papa Jeremiah? Really and truly happy?" The question carried the weight of a child's need to know that the adults in her world were content, that the happiness she could see and feel was real and permanent. Jeremiah knelt down to her level, bringing his weathered face close to her bright one. "Annie," he said with complete honesty, "I spent 12 years thinking I knew what happiness was. But I was wrong. Happiness isn't something you remember. It's something you live every single day. And every day I get to be your papa and mama's husband, I'm happier than I ever imagined possible." Satisfied with this answer, Annie kissed both parents goodnight and returned to her room, leaving them alone under the stars that had witnessed their transformation from strangers to family. "Do you think she'll remember this someday?" Rebecca asked. "When she's grown with children of her own, will she remember how it felt to be the little girl who decided her mama needed a husband and her mountain man needed a family?" "I hope so," Jeremiah replied. "I hope she remembers that the best things in life come from having the courage to speak what's in your heart, even when you're small and the world seems too big to change." Later that night, as Rebecca lay in bed beside the man who had once been a stranger and was now the other half of her heart, she thought about the photograph they'd had taken in Cheyenne during their last business trip, the first formal portrait of their family. In it, Annie sat between them wearing her best dress and her most serious expression, while Rebecca and Jeremiah looked like people who had found exactly where they belonged. The photograph now held a place of honor on their mantelpiece, but Rebecca knew the real picture lived in moments like these, in the daily routine of caring for each other, in the shared work of building something lasting, in the simple miracle of waking up each day, knowing that love had triumphed over fear and loneliness. Outside their window, the Wyoming wind whispered through the pines that crowned the distant peaks, carrying the scent of snow and promise. Somewhere in those mountains, Jeremiah's abandoned cabin stood empty, slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness that had sheltered his solitude for 12 years. But here in the valley, in a house filled with the warmth of family love, the mountain man who had forgotten how to hope had found his way home. The little girl's proposal had worked even better than she'd imagined. Her mama had found her strong man, and he had indeed needed a wife. But more than that, he had needed a daughter whose fearless heart could teach him that the best adventures begin when someone small and brave decides that lonely people should find each other and build something beautiful together. As spring melted into summer and summer ripened toward autumn, the Fletcher Ranch, now officially the Cross Ranch, though everyone still called it by its old name, became a gathering place for neighbors and friends. Annie's riding lessons progressed from cautious walks around the corral to confident trots through the meadow, always under Jeremiah's watchful eye and patient instruction. The wooden horse collection had grown to include an entire herd, each one carved with the same loving attention that had marked the first. They lived on a special shelf in Annie's room, but she still carried Spirit everywhere, the original horse that had presided over her parents' courtship and remained her most treasured possession. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the family gathered on their porch to watch the sunset behind the mountains, Rebecca sometimes caught Jeremiah looking at her with an expression of wonder, as if he still couldn't quite believe that this life was real. In those moments, she would take his hand and squeeze gently, a wordless reminder that some dreams do come true, especially when they're built on love, courage, and the faith of a 4-year-old girl who knew exactly what her family needed. The end of their story was really just the beginning, the start of a lifetime of mornings that began with shared coffee and ended with shared hopes, of seasons that brought their own challenges and rewards, of years that would deepen their understanding of what it meant to choose each other every single day. And if someday their grandchildren asked how Grandmama and Grandpapa met, the answer would always begin with a little girl who walked up to a lonely mountain man and made the kind of proposal that changes everything. My mom needs a strong man, and you need a wife. Some of the best love stories, after all, begin with the wisdom of children who see clearly what adults make complicated, and who understand that the most important words anyone can say are often the simplest. We need each other.